It's been a great conference. I had high hopes, and all of those hopes have been exceeded. I'm going to be really brief. I'm Michael Gamer here in the English department, and we're doing a roundup. And what I thought that we do something a tiny bit different than what we did yesterday, in part because we have 4 respondents, and I kind of feel like, actually, I strongly feel like this is their session, right? And so what I thought we'd do is we would hear from Mayelin Perez, Cassidy, Holohan, Liandra, and Christopher Chan. And then, rather than going and requiring the authors to respond, which I think if someone, I don't necessarily need to respond if I'm an author, I thought we'd just open it up. And if people who presented today want to, raise their hand and contribute, great. But I sort of feel like you're done with your work. You don't have to work anymore. And so with that, I'm going to give the floor to Mayelin.
Thank you so much, Michael. Can all of you hear me okay? Thank you. So along with Michael, I'd like to echo everyone else's thanks. Thank you so much, Lynn. I don't know, I can't see you right now, and John, Severe, and Tony, and everybody else that I don't know. Thank you for planning this amazing conference and the amazing exhibition, and also, most of all, being very selfish, thank you for allowing us lowly grad students an opportunity to engage with such wonderful work. So I've been charged today with the happy opportunity to engage with the first panel of the day, which was Secret Swift. That was Professor Rabb and Professor Ingracia. So Professor Rabb offered us an insightful look into transgenerational trauma, as Severe termed it earlier today, and the relationship between history, memory, and violence. So these are just very general kind of synopses. Secondly, Professor Ingracia asked us to re-engage with Pilkington's writing on Swift, and with really the relationship that Swift entertained with his so-called female triumphemminate, his closest female friends, and most of all asked us, as critics of Swift and of the 18th century, writing in the 21st century, what sort of questions should we and do we have to be asking of Swift in these different times? So I thought it would be most generative to try and engage with these papers together, because I thought that, as Helen mentioned during the Q&A for that panel, there's so much going on. They're like in conversation with each other, so I thought it would be helpful for me and perhaps for all of you. I'm not a Swift expert by any means, so this might help me get a better sense of Swift, right? So first off, I wanted to discuss the issue of intimacy that I thought circulating between both papers and between other panels so far in the conference. So intimacy is working in so many different ways and in relation to so many different genres and relationships that Swift engaged with. So I'm thinking here of the intimacy of secret history, right, and of satire. Both of these genres sort of depend on a sort of intimacy with the reader, right? A sort of community and a shared language, a shared history, right? Or otherwise, there is no real space, right, to interact between the reader and the writer and of the secret history and of the satire. So I'm interested in exploring intimacy in relation to genre as pertains to secret history and satire. But similarly, the real intimacy between Swift and other people. Professor Ingracia focused on the female authors that Swift associated with. Kind of like these relationships, how did those shape his own writing? How do they influence him? And in relation to that, really, the issue of violence that has also come up so many times before in the conference, but I saw crystallized so much in his relationship with these women, right? Like real violence exerted on their bodies and on their writing and on their spaces, right? I was so impacted by the anecdote of him, going through through Pilkington's, sorry, I'm gonna keep messing that up, house, and just kind of like investigating every room in the house and kind of like, linking the cleanliness of her house and of the most secret recesses of her house with kind of like her moral standing, right? So kind of like how intimacy and violence are operating there, I thought was a very generative question that I hope we can address as a group. And along with violence of that nature, there is of course, kind of like catastrophic violence that Professor Rab discussed, right? The Civil War trauma that impacted so much of Swift's writing. How does violence operate in that sense? So I'm interested in kind of like this large scale violence with this like very minute violence that is exerted on these women writers, and kind of like imagining Swift as an aggressor figure, as someone who inflicts violence on others, but also thinking back on the pleasure that is gotten from that, right? The voyeuristic pleasure of looking through this woman's house, right? So if we can think about all the different ways in which pleasure as a category is operating in relation to intimacy and violence, you said kind of like this new way of conceiving of secret history is so much as a multi-layered device, right? So there is a real trauma that is being layered up by perhaps it's displaced by all of these more minute secrets, right? So kind of like thinking of that as a form of sadomasochistic pleasure, right? There is the pleasure of the sadist for like inflicting or kind of like investigating other secrets, but there's also a very real, very personal trauma being hidden at the base of that. And finally, to conclude, I'm very drawn to the idea of time, and Helen, you sort of beat me to it in the Q&A earlier, but that's great. We can just continue on that. I've seen time come up so much yesterday and today in this particular panel in relation to trauma, right, and like this backwards-looking tendency of Swift, but also yesterday, David, your wonderful talk on projects and kind of like the futurity of projects as a form, and kind of like the relationship of the reader of projects, or like the society that's engaging with projects, and kind of like the relationship to the future, right? And you talked about Swift's own very fraught relationship to projects and to this idea of the future. So I want to kind of like put that in conversation with this backward glancing tendency of his, and kind of like how both of these temporal registers are relating to one another. Thank you so much. I'll leave you there.
So are we doing comments after? Okay. So for those of you I haven't met, my name is Cassidy, Holohan, and I'm a first year here at Penn. I would also really like to echo all the thanks for the organizers, as well as those who gave papers today and yesterday, because they're really generative and eye-opening at Swift in a lot of different ways. And so I feel very lucky that I'm going to comment on the 5th panel on printing and publishing Swift, in which Professor Karian talked about Swift poems that were printed and circulated privately rather than sold, and about the distinctions between private and public print circulation, and then talking on Professor Gadd's paper on choosing the editions as he works through creating a new Swift edition, choosing the copy text for political writings that will work in his new edition. And since we've spent the last 2 days together, I hope you guys don't mind, Ian and Stephen, if I just refer to you by your first name for simplicity. Okay, great. So I'd just like to go through like kind of 4 different points that I found really interesting and generative. And so first, one that was a very salient point that was brought up in our discussion is kind of this question of publication and how we define it, and also how we define edition. And Stephen kind of reminded us, especially that in the 18th century, publication did mean to make public. And I think both of their papers really kind of reflected a lot on this idea of the public versus private, and especially kind of dismantling that binary that we sometimes feel as scholars, and especially when we're working with undergrads, that kind of stays as a binary. But essentially bringing up the idea that about private manuscripts that are considered published because they're highly circulated, and as Stephen brought up, printed works that are considered private because of their small circulations. And so I thought it was kind of helpful in the commentary section, this idea that if we think about publication as making public, then not only does it get rid of this distinction between private and public, but it kind of puts publication as the idea of a degree or scale, as Tony brought up. And so I think that really kind of challenges how we think of what publication means. And we might even be able to think about it too, now going into our digital age and this whole idea of digital publications. I also thought it was interesting that the publication as temporarily making public into these, let me see, I just kind of, my second point I wanted to make about this was in Ian's talk, he was also talking about how editions are chosen based on their degree of public impact, and how you might choose a first edition rather than the last authorial edition because of its public impact. So this again really clarified this idea of public impact and public circulation that seems so important. I'm just trying to kind of meditate on that and how we kind of measure that. And the other thing which we weren't able to bring up in the question comments to that was, and this is again a little bit focusing on Stephen's part, in which Swift tied publication so closely to money, both in his letters and in which frontispieces were identified as published works, and it seemed to be they were only published if they were sold, if there was money exchanged, if they were given a value. And so I'm thinking about how this also might be important when we think about publication, and thinking about these circulated printed works as kind of non-commodities because they were not bought, and how this lack of ownership might kind of tie to another theme of today, which was the idea of the distance between the reader and the text. And if the circulation of these texts not only creates a community, but if there's something in political writing, and especially satirical writing, that works not only, that works well with circulation because there is that distance, there is that lack of ownership, that ability to pass it on, that one should continue to pass on that print. So yeah, that was my one thing I was thinking. If we bring in the idea of commodities and money, it might kind of challenge our idea of publication once again. My third point I wanted to bring up was the idea of print as ephemeral, which I think was kind of something that was toyed around with in both papers, because there was a focus on how quickly everything was published and how many editions were kind of doubled up on each other. And I think, I'm sorry, I do not remember who made this remark, but talking about, let me find the exact quote here. Oh, I think it was Ian who discussed multiple editions that were printed in such quick succession that we might consider them like a singular textual moment. And I thought that was something that, like, if we have time to, I'd really love to return to, because it really does push on this idea of what is an edition and which one it is, and also really focuses on the quick pace. And I'm thinking of another moment in which, I think it was Ian again here, and I'm so sorry because these papers were so well paired, that talked about how these, it was Stephen, who talked about how these print poems were circulated and they were often therefore found to the reader, that they might be left in coffee houses or thrown into coaches. And I'm also thinking then of how they might have been lost so easily because of this kind of non-ownership. So again, that had me thinking about the idea of their ephemerality, which again, also, and I'm just kind of making connections here because there were so many, really kind of solidify the point that Helen just made in her talk about thinking about Swift as an author as someone who intervenes, and that, really focusing on these texts as something we might consider more ephemeral and not canonical, and just thinking about if that changes the way we study them, if that changes the way we create editions or comment on them. And then just to make kind of 2 points on things that this generated for me, going a little bit further away from exactly what they discussed, but having recently been kind of looking into a little bit of new media theory, I was really interested in the question of format and form that these both kind of raised. And I'm especially thinking of those really thin, long strips of political poems that had to be printed in that specific size to evade the taxes, and thinking about how in this case, following the influence of the printer, how that printing necessity, and probably by the urging of the printer, how that format would have changed how that poem was written, both in line breaks and length. And so kind of thinking about how the editor is so important not only in circulation and publication, but how looking at the material text really has us think about how the format and circulation might have impacted genre and where those kind of come into play. And thinking in the same line of the importance of the printer, this is my last kind of point here, is I was really interested in the idea of things being excised or taken away from the text. And I know how Ian discussed how entire sections were taken away from and I think it was the poem, The Conduct of Alleys, and how later editions were printed without those huge sections, and yet were still considered the same poem. And Ian was talking about having to choose from all of these editions to choose one. And so when we're talking in our kind of comment section about how Swift was okay with printers taking things away, especially because they had, the printers were going to be the one who had any kind of political consequences, and yet Swift never would have been okay with addition. Or, he's very upset with Gulliver's Travels when things were added. And so just think about the role of the printer then and the editor now. It kind of really, as the last point, it kind of had me thinking about how much can be excised from a text before it stops becoming that text, and really thinking about when we think about a text, especially in this kind of mode of thinking about a final edition of Swift in the 21st century, why can we think about things being taken away and it still becomes that same, it still stays that same poem in that time or this time, but things added, it doesn't have the same, wow, I just lost my chain of thought. It doesn't work the same way. So yeah, those are a few of my thoughts.
Hi, everyone. My name is Liandra. I'm also a first year like Cassidy. I have the privilege and honor of commenting on the sixth panel, which is Comic Violence, very aptly named. I wanted to start with from a very personal perspective, because one of my goals when I come out with a degree from this program is to be able to articulate to my parents why the 18th century matters for us. And I think Cecilia and Elizabeth, if I could call you guys by your first name, their papers very much spoke to not only a very politically resonant moment between the 1930s and now, but also in a very pedagogical perspective. Why is Swift being taught, and how, and what the fissures and the disciplines are that canonize him in a certain way, especially for a text where Chris Chan was telling me earlier, Modest Proposal was his first encounter in high school for Swift. So I think that that's like something we can contemplate. I'll start with, and please help me with the pronunciation, pathonymies of laughter. I'm very tempted to say pathonymy, so, but I was very struck by that, because if we think about surrealism and the French etymology breakdown of it, sur, above, realisme, reality, I thought the Breton's description of Swift as having this writing in the mood of superior revolt of the mind very generative in that sense, especially if we think about the fact that surrealism came up around the 1930s, which is co-emergent with Nazism and fascism. And from just outside knowledge, I also know that Louis Buñuel, in his own manifesto for surrealism, wanted to take up where the Marxists failed and produce a revolution of the mind. So I think the fact that Swift, for Breton in the French context, was not only included in his anthology, but the first one, the originator, let's say, of gallows humor or humor noir, is super generative. As a first year and non-expert of Swift, I don't know how to chew on that even, to keep using eating and food metaphors. And for me, the most striking takeaway for me is the idea of pathognomie and the symptom indicating an underlying malady, and how Swift, as a writer, rhetorically achieves that kind of, I would say, incisive diagnosis, especially with the closer reading of the structure of Modest Proposal in the second paper does. I feel like they complement each other in that way. And Cecilia's point about situation being more foregrounded in the description and the definition of Black humor is, to use that word again, very generative for me too, because the fact that, as in the later panel, that Said can converse and engage with Swift despite his political conservatism means that that there is something, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, that there is something about Swift and the situation that we can still not excavate, because I think he's very much the what's it called, the savage indignation is very much alive. And I think in our, very horrible political context, it's very useful to remember that this isn't the first time he was made resonant. So I think that was very generative. Thank you so much. And then for the second paper, I found that your identification of the fissure in the two disciplines of composition and instruction in rhetoric and composition, and that of literary criticism and history, also very generative, because if I think about the few times I've been taught Modest Proposal and how it is, as you say, the model argumentative essay, it almost kills the vitality of it. It makes it rigid. It ossifies Swift in a way, like, oh, here's a model 18th century essay, rather than one that has an ironic relationship with its legacy, with Swift's own legacy with the ancients. And I believe we can learn a lesson or two about engaging with that legacy in a very playful and in a very ironic way. And here the idea of Gothic as a disruption in civilization, it's very poignant to think about his rhetoric in that way. The irony being very disruptive, and I wonder if maybe we can take that too, because I'm not teaching yet, but someday I will, and for the current instructors and professors of the room, I wonder if that would be productive to share with your students about this idea of an ironic relationship with your legacy and the literary tradition with which one deploys to not correct, as Cecilia says, a current political moment, but to render it absurd, or to break it away, or to have a very disassembling relationship with it. So I wanted to end with I just want to end with, first of all, thank you again for these two papers. I really don't have many questions because I'm still chewing on these things, and I can't wait to talk about these papers in class. I guess all I want to ask is, for Cecilia, how do you think the historical moment of the American context of 1960s Black humor, you mentioned that they very much engage with the language that Breton uses in his anthology and in his manifesto, but then they don't really explicitly say that they're fighting against him. So I guess for a more historical elucidation on the topic, how what was it going on in the moment that made them engage with Breton in that very implicit way, and what made them decide to go against it? If, that's a big question, so you don't have to answer it, but we can also open it to everybody else. And then for Elizabeth, I also want to ask how you handle, how do you handle conveying this kind of pugilistic, ironic relationship with rhetoric and the argumentative model essay, say with unspecialized students, because I'm sure that we encounter a lot of students who won't be going into PhD programs on Swift. So I just wanted to ask that. Again, like I'd welcome any other perspective on this issue. So thank you very much, everyone.
Hi, so I'm Chris Chan, and as the last of our first-time speakers, I guess I would like to add to the chorus of thanks for Lynn, for John, for the Kislak Center for hosting such a wonderful conference, and especially to Tony, Michael, and Suvir for giving us the opportunity to comment on, again, some very generative and very astounding papers in their own ways. So I've been tasked with commenting on the panel just recently concluded, Swift, Our Contemporary, and I kind of want to begin with the title, and in particular, the colon in the title, Swift, Our Contemporary. And I'm thinking about this colon, this particular punctuation mark, in the sense that it's an equal sign, right? Swift is our contemporary, Swift equals our contemporary, and so we have this relationship of identity, right? We sort of claim identity to an extent with Swift in identifying whether it be our critical stance, our interest in his period, or other prerogatives that we might bring to the table. And yet at the same time, and I think this sort of feeds off of Liandra's remarks that she just made, the colon to me also has this distancing effect. And I kind of want to think about this through Helen's paper on Said, and in particular on Said's language of describing his own relationship with Swift, and also with the way that Swift gets presented in particular secular criticism, which I kind of want to talk about more too at length. So when using that sort of colon as a starting point, I suppose, we might think of that punctuation mark as enacting a kind of endless present tense in an endlessly tense present, which is to say that the colon sort of marks us in this moment that really we can escape and really can't quite escape us. And I kind of want to use that as a starting point to think maybe a bit more deeply about Said and his critical practice, and use that as a way to think about Swift in turn. So in beginning with the colon then, I want to think about a couple of concepts that Said brings up in secular criticism. And in particular, I want to think about his distinction between filiation and affiliation, which I believe Helen sort of gestured toward in her paper. And as we probably already know, Said describes, right, the trajectory of intellectualism in its public eyes as sort of moving away from, for better or for worse at least, this sort of filiative model whereby the critic, the reader, the apprehender of a text claims a filial bond or some sort of organic relationship with the object in question. And so the sort of critical discourse and the tone that one produces is one of a kind of identity, a kind of equal sign, so to speak. And then gradually we sort of get this very broad and yet somehow discernible shift whereby filiation becomes affiliation, wherein that relationship becomes one of distance, one of professionalism, right, of a sort of studied, if there's a synonym for distance, I'd appreciate it here, but certainly some kind of distance. And maybe one quote that I'd like to pull out from Said on Swift might be the most summative of his remarks. So Said writes in Secular Criticism on Swift, "He stands so far outside the world of contemporary critical discourse as to serve as one of its best critics, methodologically unarmed though he may have been." And that distancing language, right, we have tragically compromised by his time and circumstances, stands so far outside and even methodologically unarmed to an extent. I mean, that language of distancing, to me, is one of the more powerful things, certainly of Said's criticism, but I think also of Swift. And when I say of Swift, I should also mention I sort of still have a vexed relationship with Swift, and this is sort of the colon coming back into the picture. As someone who is still trying to think about this field, but particularly more recently about historiographies of 18th century studies, of its writers and of its texts, I feel particularly invested in figuring out precisely what my relationship is with Swift, not even just Swift, but really any poet that I'm writing about. And there are times where I feel like that relationship is filiative, in that I can sort of presume for a moment that when I write about a particular poem by Swift or not by Swift, I can sort of claim, inherently at least, the equal sign to say that my statement is sort of claiming a sort of common, I guess, heritage might be one way to think about this. And this sort of gets me into John's paper too, thinking about that trajectory from, right, Swift through Stern, through Jefferson, through Scalia even, to sort of this American crisis of identity, so to speak. And then thinking about filiation and affiliation and that language of distancing, I'm also thinking then of Said's remarks on several things. And I don't want to go too much in like that on each of these, partly because I think we're familiar with many of these. But one particular aspect that I think might be worth bringing up in terms of thinking about heritage and distancing and professionalism is how Said writes on Auerbach, right? I mean, Auerbach is such a central figure for Said, and the way that Said writes about Auerbach is at once, and again, it's that colon. I feel like it's empowering, but also there's that necessary distancing that I'm still not sure how to interpret as a budding critic, so to speak. So when Said writes on Auerbach, he's actually writing, well, he's sort of, right, rehearsing the narrative that Auerbach is preserving Western literature in mimesis, at least, from his vision of exile, having been exiled to Turkey in the early 20th century. And when Said writes about Auerbach in secular criticism, he's using Vico, right, to sort of celebrate this sort of ideal relationship of one's self to one's work and also one's homeland, so to speak. And I'll just quote really briefly. And this is Said quoting Vico in his section of Auerbach. So, the tender soul has fixed his love on one spot in the world. The strong man has extended his love to all places. The perfect man has extinguished his. And then Said proceeds, right, to think about this relationship, and maybe not in secular criticism so much, but certainly in his later work. And here I'm sort of transitioning to another and possibly my final concept, and that's the concept of exile. I'm thinking about Reflections on Exile, which I believe he wrote in '85 or the mid-'80s. And it's a profoundly moving essay. The first time I encountered it was in Chi-Ming Yang's Theorizing Orientalism seminar 2 years ago. And it was at that moment, coming just before exams, I think, where I started to think very deeply about my own investments with this heritage that is at once intimate in the sense of the equal sign, and yet somehow so profoundly distant. And that distance, I think, comes to all of us in many ways, although albeit unevenly, whether we're working with Swift paratextually, be it through footnotes and endnotes, whether we're sort of really still persistently, maybe always, trying to uncover, right, these secret histories, trying to recontextualize, just trying to recover, I suppose, in all senses of the word, Swift's moment and, of course, its resonances for our moment. But to think about the way that Said writes on exile and the way that Said also writes about Swift in this language of distancing just always makes me wonder, and I think it will continue to do, it'll kind of haunt me really. It's just to think about, right, the sort of nature of that bond that we have with our work. And speaking as a person of color, as a sort of first generation academic in my family, and as someone, again, who is really trying to rethink problems of historiography, of heritage, of legacy, I'm just wondering, and to go back to the colon then, whether in thinking about Swift as our contemporary, Swift being our contemporary, Swift our contemporary, no colon, I'm just curious in the pressures that we face, each of us, unevenly, I should mention, when we think about those two terms together. Thank you.
Let's open it up. Right in back. Thank you, Lynn, for...
There we go. All right, Great, thank you. Thank you all for your comments. I was really struck when Mayelin used the concept of intimacy, not so much in relation to Swift or what we've talked about in terms of Swift, but what we do in terms of our own intellectual labor and the labor that we're recording that Swift and people that he worked with whether it's the editing of Swift's poems and sort of the intimacy of that labor, the relationship between the printer and the author and how that relies on that true sense of intimacy, the intimacy of curation and literally, truly walking sort of in the footsteps both of previous scholars and Swift. And perhaps most obviously the intimacy of Helen's project and this idea of not just the personal commitment that it demands, but the ways in which you are truly sort of channeling or recreating a very intimate relationship. And I think forums like this over the last 2 days require us to be in this sort of public and scholarly mode. And we too often forget that while we can talk about the intimacy of the literary object or the figure that we study, that we really need to think about our own intimacies in terms of our connections with the texts and how we can think about that. So it's not a question, it's just sort of I was struck by the use of the term intimacy and ways which we might be able to think about that beyond just Swift and his work.
I'm also struck with intimacy, but in a maybe more pointed way. So thanks for raising that, because I think that it casts an interesting light on the discussion earlier on publication versus private circulation. And I'd just like to point out that Swift wrote a very substantial body of work that was not published in his lifetime at all. So perhaps he was disappointed that some of it was not published, but I imagine that most of it was written for a very small and, dare I say, intimate audience. Some of it was published after its original intended audience and occasion had passed, but published in his lifetime. The Humble Petition of Francis Harris would be an example. The Market Hill poems would be probably examples also. But I think it helps to think that there can be a number of audiences, perhaps at different times. So that perhaps gets us a little bit out of the stark binary division between publishing and not publishing.
Thank you. And just to pick up on that, the famous Faulkner edition, Faulkner Volume 2 of the poems, which is on display, has this amazing aspect, which is that certain poems were canceled by Swift after printing. But then the poor printer, or the poor publisher, had a bunch of pages to fill, and Swift helped him in large part by using the Market Hill poems as the replacement poems. So those private poems of that circle became the ones to fill in the gaps so the book could be complete. It also makes us think about money in the context of printing, because there's going to be, you talk about commodity, you raise that issue. The internet, we hear all the time, is free, but we all know there's money somewhere that has to be spent or exchanged. And to connect some of the other papers that were talked about, there can be a subscription edition. Catherine talked about Mary Barber's poems on several occasions where the prospective readers pay in advance to effectively subsidize the publication. And James brought up the Delaney's epistle to Carteret, which existed as a very beautiful folio edition that is in the Lee Library. But if you go to the colophon of that, it tells anyone who's looking at it that you can get the small edition for sale at Grierson's shop. There's another form of subsidizing a publication, which I think is correct. Ian can tell me if I'm wrong here, but Ian showed all the print runs of The Conduct of the Allies, huge numbers. And my understanding is that this was a work that by and large was subsidized by the ministry, because the point was to get it out there. It was not to make money, it was to generate as much publicity for the upcoming parliamentary session. So it was not meant as a vehicle for sale principally, but to become public as much as possible to help to the party. And an interesting combination here is the Drapier's letters, because in the Drapier's letters, the Drapier makes references to the fact that the price, the sale of these pamphlets have been kept very low for the purpose of having the widest possible distribution. Now, if that's the case, somebody, Swift, I assume, must have subsidized a considerable cost of the pamphlets. Otherwise, poor Harding, would have lost money, and that would have been completely unfair. So the range is extraordinarily diverse in just the examples I cited, which were, of course, things brought up by the various panelists. So thanks.
Two things I wanted to quick add were just, one, our folks responding should respond at any point. It's your floor. But secondly, one of the things that really struck me is in all the papers, and I've been thinking about it again through rubrics like intimacy, public and private, what gets published and not published, the Swift we encounter as opposed to the Swift that his contemporaries encountered, and the fact that his contemporaries encountered very different versions of Swift depending on their levels of intimacy or party affiliation with him. Some read certain Swifts, some read other Swifts, is that every one of us who's spoken today, I think, or yesterday, or listened, there's been a kind of subterranean story, which is we've all had to confront a canonical Swift, and we've all kind of had to overcome that. And depending on who we are, because I want to take up Chris's point strongly, that story of how we end up how we end up finding a relationship that's not the one that's first handed to us or that we've inherited seems a really good story to also tell in connection with all this, especially if we want to think about pedagogy.
I just want to build right on what you said, actually. But first I want to just, all of you, thank you all for these really great responses. I mean, it's just amazing. But Chris, I just want to say I was just incredibly moved by what you said, and I'm going to keep thinking about it and probably write you and ask if I can cite you somehow or something. But when you talk about filiation, and I want to just, there are a few quick things I wanted to say because I think we're very much in sync and are thinking about this. And the first is when he summoned, Said quotes that Wordsworth sonnet, putting Swift instead of Wordsworth is a way of rewriting a certain kind of nationalist filiation of Milton and England and empire and nostalgia for sort of this lost greatness, rewriting it as exile and distance. So I think that's really important, and what you were saying about the colon really kind of gets at that. The other thing I think that's really interesting about the way you were putting John's and my paper together, and it's connected, Michael, to what you were saying about how we come to different Swifts. So I really came to Said because of Swift. I would not have been interested in him otherwise, and that would have been my loss. And similarly, Said writes in Humanism and Democratic Criticism that he would not have come to Swift if it hadn't been for Yeats. That he hated Swift, and he thought he was conservative and uninteresting. And then he read Yeats's version, and he has this word for how Yeats reads Swift, which is magnanimous. And that is a model, I think, for me, of also a sort of mode of reading of the past, where it is about distance and it is about affiliation, like you choose it, right? It's not like you're just born into it, you choose it, and there is a generosity there. And then finally, that passage about, comes from, that you're quoting in the passage on Vico, it comes from Hugh of St. Victor, which a medieval thinker, about whom I know almost nothing. And Auerbach quotes it too in the Philology of World Literature. And it's a passage about how, in Hugh of St. Victor, it's about Christian renunciation, about how the virtuous man gets more and more virtuous by learning to stop loving individual people. It's like that Swift Pope opposition, they hate individual people or love the world, etc. The Christian man ends up loving everyone as a way to end up just loving God, right? But in Auerbach, it's about loving the world. It's about a kind of cosmopolitanism, a kind of embrace of exile in a positive way. So what I find so moving about Said's attachment to that quotation, which is really a talisman for him, and he quotes it numerous times, is it's satire. Satire is part of it, but love is another part. And I do feel like we haven't talked about love a lot in relation to Swift, but I feel like there is great love in Said's work.
Could I quickly respond? Sorry. Just very quickly, thanks so much, Helen, for that. That was incredibly generative. And it actually gets me to a point that I wish I had sort of included too, and it's Said's fundamental interest in conversation, right? The idea of oral communication, and I guess we could also think about Paula's paper on orality and acoustic sometimes I feel like the best way to, I guess, identify in some sense with the poets and people that I write on is to really imagine, right, a kind of voice, or to always keep in mind that the voice is living, that the voice is in that endless present, and to sort of work that into, right, a sort of more immediate, possibly an intimate moment. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. But you had your hand up. But you were a speaker. Okay, all right. Well, here we go. I just. All right, very good. So thank you all for listening so carefully and trying to put pieces together over the course of the day. I wanted to say something. I mean, this idea of intimacy versus distance, and also these binaries of the past, the history versus the future with regard to Swift. I mean, I think that we all feel, I think we all work on Swift because we feel a certain intimacy with him. And he speaks to us for different reasons. And it can be a very contentious and challenging relationship, but there is that part of it. And I think one of the reasons why we feel that intimacy is because there is something in Swift's work. We feel that whether it's published or not published, whatever, that he always cared. He was always provoked to speak out, to use his voice in some ways, whether it's angry or sardonic or killingly funny or whatever, but, he's there. But I wanted to just say a word about the future, because I feel that Swift is just radically contingent. When you read his work, it's topical, it is responsive to particulars in a moment, even though we could say that there are also more general things that he's concerned about. But with respect to the future, I was thinking about his will. And again, the will is, I think, very contingent, because he leaves money to support the clergy of Laricourt. But he builds into his will the possibility that there may be no more clergy in Laricourt, that the church may disappear there. And he specifies that if that happens, the money is to be distributed to the poor. Mm-hmm. So it's not that he didn't have a view of the future or hopes for the future or plans for the future, including the hospital for the insane, which is still there, but that it was with the understanding that you couldn't fully bank on things being the way you might wish they were. I mean, it's one of the things that in the discussions about the texts and the changes in the text, I mean, the one thing that is so poignant about print culture is that while it's spreading information, it also is taking control out of the hands of the author, both in terms of the actual physical reality of the text as it's edited or lost or whatever, but also, of course, as it's read by different people in ways that the author can't control.
I wanted to just a quick comment. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. Also, there's been so many mentions on Swift as kind of like this sort of control freak, right? There's always this need to keep a level of control even when things seem the most chaotic, right? Most kind of like most Helen, you mentioned kind of like when there is like unbounded garbage, but there's kind of like this reference to there's like to numbers to kind of like control the like unbounded like waste, right? So there's always that like push. So I think that when thinking of the future as kind of like the most unbounded of things, right, the most uncontrollable of things, it really is illuminating to see him, Swift, kind of like this control, this controlling presence, still trying to exert a sort of agency over it once he's like passed on.
That's true, but knowing at the same time that he really can't control it.
Yeah, so there's always like this. Like,
Yeah.
No, it's really, thank you.
Hi, we've kind of passed my moment, but I want to come back to Chris's pressure on the colon and on what it does to us when it's read as an equal sign, and the importance of uneven affiliations. And the flip side of affiliation and intimacy is alienation, estrangement, defamiliarization, and unfunny disgust. And there's moments when I've been disgusted reading Swift, not by, images of Corinna or, scatological stuff, but just by certain assumptions that I don't share, even though he's, probably my all-time favorite author. And I don't know what your relationship, Helen, is to Said, but I know that as I work with Marshall McLuhan, I'm at once fascinated and admiring, and yet sometimes just disgusted by some of his assumptions, as a young man or whatever. And I was thinking about how Said's own readings of authors like Conrad or Austen, who he clearly really admires as writers, refuse to find full affiliation or to excuse them. And I'd just be interested to hear from pretty much anyone here about when you're working with Swift and you find something that is repugnant to you, or maybe some people don't, other than, well, we're uncomfortable with misogyny, but hey, it was a long time ago. I'd be interested to hear about that kind of relationship with one's subject.
I'm going to say I'm working on a big project for Walt Whitman 200, and there's a lot of issues there that we're confronting and trying to confront head on. So exactly that kind of thing. There are things that are like, wait a second, what are we going to talk about there? How are we going to deal with that particular thing? So I think that that's very much the case, and is something that a lot of us have to deal with in these kinds of projects, is that, you can't just elide it. You have to actually face it head on. Yes. Yeah, no. Anyone else?
Actually, there first, that's it.
Who? Where?
The gentleman.
John Henry. John
Yeah, he's been very patient. Thank you very
much. I just had to do this kind of thing of like, now we've heard of everything. What didn't come up as much is kind of sometimes interesting to reflect on. And I just had three quick things. And the first was actually misogyny. And so now it's come up. But I was thinking about it more in terms of, previous generations of scholarship kind of walking in their footsteps. And, it's because a lot of good work has been done that we kind of, and this is how scholarship works, is that we kind of we're standing on the shoulders of that very important work that was done. So that was just striking to me. It's not that we don't care anymore, maybe so much as that we've kind of maybe resolved certain irresolvable things. Similarly with Ireland, it hasn't really come up as such or as a kind of bone of contention or an issue. We've kind of found various ways of addressing that and incorporating that, which is just an interesting moment, reflection on an interesting moment we're in Swift scholarship. John Stubbs' biography, in case you didn't have time to read that 700-page biography yet, does a really, the reluctant rebel kind of colon, the reluctant rebel captures nicely that. Swift and slavery, though, coming at the kind of uneven kind of affiliations question is not, and I was maybe Jefferson's reception of Swift would be one way if I was kind of didn't talk about that, but that would be one way to go with that. And then to be a bit more contentious, we haven't talked, I love Gulliver's Travels, and that's not a controversial thing to say, but it's maybe been striking that hasn't been as central to our discussions, maybe because, it was subtending my discussion, but I didn't go into it, so that may be true for other people as well. It's been more central in the wonderful exhibition, actually, than it has in our discussion as such. And I think that Swift, I want to say, Swift did have a coherent satiric project that he largely fulfilled in the Travels. That's just to be contentious for the sake of it, but anyway. I just wanted to say that two words, Chris's emphasis on the colon and reinforced by
a later mention of the word pressure reminds me that we have Swift speaking through us. You cannot have excremental vision without both those terms in simultaneous conjunction. And forgive me for saying that.
So the various ways that I think we've been reconstituting Swift as vestigial provocation or annoyance or challenge has drawn my attention to how much time has passed, specifically between 2003, when Said, wished Swift to exist, and the current moment. And it makes me wonder the degree to which Swiftian satire is better suited to the project of neoconservatism, which needed to have its contradictions and hypocrisies called out, as opposed to the current moment that doesn't seem, where the politics of Trump don't make that same kind of promise. Bush invaded Iraq under the pretense that he was saving it. He was to save Iraq from itself and, by extension, an entire Islamic world. Trump says America first. So I wonder when it is most efficacious to summon Swift and how we do that and how that changes from decade to decade and what we might think of as the modernity we inhabit.
Thank you. This is just a sort of quick postscript in response to Paula's question about things we still find annoying, things we have a hard time getting around. I have to say, I share the reactions of several people who've said, well, of course, the misogyny, and of course, there are all kinds of things that are still hard to take. When you read even Swift, a writer you love very much. But I find myself, I guess it's because I've been working on Modest Proposal and texts that are related to it, especially the proposal regarding badging beggars. Swift's attitude toward the poor, yes, I know it's very 18th century. Yes, it's a it's an attitude that arises out of a deeply ingrained ethic of personal responsibility and religious duty and social obedience and all kinds of things like that. But it's still just hard to take. The idea that somehow it's the poor, it's the fault of the poor that they're poor at some level, and this is in spite of Swift. It goes hand in hand with Swift's deep compassion for them, the sense of fury that people are dying right in front of his very eyes, and he hates that, and he's trying to do something about it and can't. And but the corollary to that is it's also their fault. It's also their problem, and that's something that's just really hard to take. And part of the reason I mention this is it does lead me to respond to Liandra's very good comment and question to me at the end of her comment about how you handle teaching the Modest Proposal to a group of non-specialists undergraduates who are even whether it's in the context of writing instruction or not. But I have found when I have taught the piece to a general literature survey, I spend a lot of time emphasizing the way in which the use of the structure of the piece emphasizes Swift's distance from his audience. But then I find it helpful to talk about the proposal for badging beggars as a way of emphasizing that Swift is complicit with what he is satirizing. That's an easier route to take than trying to sort of do what I've done here and flip over the classical model on its head and suggest that there are complexities there. It's something they see much more easily. They read, I read them a few paragraphs from the proposal for badging beggars, and the hair stands up on the backs of their necks, and they say, "Oh no, that sounds like where's the real Swift here?" And with that kind of juxtaposition, you can get somewhere, and it's something that appeals to the fact that I think they share the same kind of icky reaction that I think a lot of us do to this very 18th century attitude that we just don't share, most of us anyway, I think these days.
I'm just going to say quickly, I think there are a lot of people in the culture today who think the poor, who think they're, it's the poor's fault. So I'm not sure, yeah.
Swift more relevant than ever today.
Well, I don't really have a comment other than to say I'm just surprised that Charlie Hebdo hasn't come up because we have been discussing some of the more disturbing aspects of satire. I remember when I moved into my office at one of the places I taught, somebody had a Charlie Hebdo cartoon on their door, but then the next day when she met me, it had disappeared, right? So there is some sense that we are sort of foreclosing some of the, we know that we're foreclosing some of the more disturbing aspects of this work of art that we're appreciating, but there are certain moments when we can't keep appreciating it in a way that suddenly we realize is a little slimy, So I guess, and when I think of Charlie Hebdo, I just think of the trolling paper, very much about how Trumpian, how Swiftian Trump is being sometimes. So. You don't like that, do you?
No, I'm smiling, just thinking of possibilities.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Maybe just because in the context of a conference on Swift in the 21st century, nobody's picked up on the idea of ephemerality, which is interesting, and listening to what was said about how we all come to Swift from our own specific perspectives. I came to Swift from a kind of whence perspective because I started off working on how Swift fits into a tradition of writing about imaginary voyages, particularly how he fits into a tradition related to imaginary voyages in French. And then after that, I started looking at the whither and what happens to Gulliver's Travels after Swift. And it seems to me, thinking also about what was said yesterday about Swift's attitude to writing and text and the ephemeral, one of the paradoxical things about him, or one of the anxieties about him, is his relationship both to the past, to the fact that he's very aware of all those who came before him, the traditions that he fits in with, that he respects, that he imitates, and with his position in relation to the future. I mean, how many people write that many poems about themselves and what's going to happen after they're dead and who they were and how people are going to look at them afterwards? And I think he was very concerned with what would come after. I have not much to say about that, but I think it's an interesting point that we perhaps haven't looked at in enough detail about how he tries to write his own future even while he's still alive. And in Gulliver's Travels, he mentions the fact that future generations won't be able to understand the ones that came before them because language changes too quickly, and how books are always buried by the mass of books that come after them. And I often wonder when we're talking about Swift still today, what he would think about how much we still talk about him, what a prominent figure he's become. Would he be pleased? Would he be pleased with the way that we talk about him and the way that we react to him, or not? So that maybe that's the next conference.
I was sort of waiting for the moment that my comments wouldn't be taking us off into a left field, into Breton territory. But I first want to say thank you to these excellent, exquisite at times responses, and thank you so much, Liandra, for such really interesting questions. And you actually posed such a forceful question that I feel compelled that I have to respond. But first, I want to pick up on this idea of ephemerality as well, because so much of what was said really interested me. But that on the first day, that ephemerality versus monumentality, and that was sort of the Pope and the Swift pairing. And obviously, I'm very interested in the way that Swift gets paired. And that's what that La Rochefoucauld picture of him from on the verses of Dr. Swift's death. It was so interesting because he's getting paired in different ways, and so the binaries change based on the pairing. And so the issue of intimacy became so clearly very productive for everybody. It's very interesting. But particularly, I liked the way you connected pleasure and violence, right, with the intimate. So it's this sense that the intimate is about love. And I love that you brought up love. And shockingly, in Breton's preface on Swift, he brings up love. And that whole, I don't love humanity, but I love John, and naming each individual. And I think that's really important for Breton, actually. And I think I had that surprise. I was sort of honestly prejudiced against Breton. I was really curious to see and really got to understand a little bit better, obviously, his project. And he really talks a lot about love. And what's interesting in his collection, the anthology, is how intimate it is. He includes letters from somebody he was in the war with, who he says really taught him Black humor on the battlefield. And then you look at the life and death dates, and he died at like 23 years old. And this is sort of the wisest man he'd ever met. And the whole book is, in a way, an epitaph to that man. So in a way, to answer, so that intimacy is love, but how quickly, as you pointed out, it can turn negative. And that was what, I'm so sorry, Sharif? Yes. Brought up with Spivak and Said so beautifully, right? This intimacy, that there's certainly an affiliation there, but there's also that pain, the violence, and the too close, when close is no longer wanted. And so then to answer your question, which was really about the political background and really the reception then of Swift, but really the reception of Breton and why he's in a sense killed. And I think it's, it was the questions of ephemerality versus monumentality that really, I wanted to rewrite my paper, because that rewriting of the anthology of Black humor without any gesture to the first one that launches the term is such a violent act. And yet the more I thought about it, it was so true to Breton. People asked him over and over to redo and add names and take out names. And he made some different amendments and different additions, but finally he said, no, it is the symptom of that moment. It is what it is, and that moment is gone. And so in a way, the Black humorists, by kind of rejecting him or not naming him, is in that spirit of revolt, in that spirit of, it's a love, but it's the very first act of Breton's book is rejection. In order to love Swift, he rejects Voltaire. And really, it's about rejecting Voltaire. And so I feel like the American Black humorists it's also an act of rejection, not necessarily stated, but that there's love there, right? So it's, so I think that where I come back to this monumentality versus ephemerality, that the ephemerality is sort of a gift, right? It's leaving the door for somebody to define it, replace it, keep poking, right? Diagnose and find the signs that we can diagnose with. Yeah. So thank you.
Right behind you. And
so I just wanted to quickly say that I'm sitting here listening and thinking about all the resonant moments in our conference, and the one that I can't forget is John Havard saying, not to mention religion, right? Which I kind of wish we had thought about more. I think it's such a problem, and kind of a lot of these other problems maybe inhere in the problems of Swift and religion. And I don't have anything else to say about it, except that I kind of, if I could have one more thing, it would be that. So